Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. It's been 3 months since it happened, and I still can't sleep properly. I'm a junior at UC Santa Barbara, studying marine biology, and I've always been the type who needs space when things get heated at home. My parents had this explosive fight about my dad's drinking problem during Thanksgiving break, and I just couldn't handle being in that house anymore. The yelling, the slamming doors, my mom crying, it was too much. I did what I always do when I need to think. I drove down to the coast. There's this stretch of beach near Carpinteria where I used to go as a kid, and there's always been this old Victorian house sitting right on the bluff, boarded up and forgotten. I'd driven past it hundreds of times over the years, always wondering what it looked like inside. That night, I finally found out. The house had this weird magnetism that evening. Maybe it was because I was feeling so displaced from my own home, but something about that abandoned place called to me. It was around 9 p.m. when I parked my beat-up Subaru on the gravel shoulder and walked up the overgrown path. The fog was rolling in thick from the ocean, and the whole place seemed frozen in time. The Victorian's paint was peeling in long strips, and most of the windows were covered with weathered plywood that had warped and split over the years. But here's the thing. When I walked around to the back, I noticed one of the boards covering a side door was loose, hanging by just a couple of rusted nails. It would have been easy to pry it open, and that's exactly what I did, using a piece of driftwood I found in the yard. The door creaked open into what used to be a kitchen, and the smell hit me immediately. Musty wood, salt air, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate through the space, and honestly, it was like stepping into a time capsule from the 1970s. Avocado green appliances covered in dust, wallpaper with these hideous orange flowers, linoleum floors curled up at the edges. Water damage had left brown stains running down the walls like dried tears. I was just taking it all in, thinking about how sad it was that such a beautiful house had been left to rot when I heard it. A soft cough coming from somewhere deeper in the house. My heart started pounding, but I called out anyway. "Hello? Anyone there?" That's when I met Theodore. He appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and what looked like a living room, and the guy was probably in his 50s, wearing this faded flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. His hair was salt and pepper, kind of wild like he'd been sleeping rough, and he had these pale blue eyes that seemed almost too bright in the dim light. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I've been staying here for a few weeks. Name's Theodore, but most folks call me Teddy." He didn't seem threatening at all, just tired and maybe a little lonely. I introduced myself as Jake and explained I was just trying to get away from family drama. Teddy nodded like he understood completely. "This old place has a way of calling to people who need shelter," he said. "Been doing it for decades." We ended up sitting in the living room on these old dusty chairs that creaked whenever we moved. Teddy had set up a small camping lantern on the mantelpiece, and the warm glow made everything feel less spooky. He was actually pretty good company, told me he'd been a carpenter before life got complicated, and he knew a lot about the house's history. "The Whitmore family built this place in 1923, he said, his voice taking on this storytelling quality. "Old Henry Whitmore made his fortune in the oil business, brought his wife and 3 kids here from back east. They were happy for a while, from what I heard." He paused and looked around the room with these sad eyes. "But happiness doesn't last forever, does it? Especially not in houses like this." The way he said it gave me chills, but I was curious. I asked him what happened to the family, and that's when his whole demeanor changed. Teddy's face went serious, and he leaned forward in his chair, the lantern light casting weird shadows across his features. "There was an incident in 1978, he said quietly. "The youngest daughter, Helen, she was only 16. Beautiful girl, according to the old newspaper clippings I found upstairs. She disappeared one night in October, right around Halloween. Police searched for weeks, but they never found her body. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. But they found evidence. Blood in the basement, signs of a struggle. Someone had hurt that girl real bad before. He trailed off, shaking his head. Her father went crazy with grief, started drinking heavy. The mother couldn't take it anymore and moved back east with the other kids. Henry stayed here alone until he died in 1981, some say from a broken heart. The way Teddy told the story, with all these specific details, it felt like he'd been thinking about it for a long time. What really got to me was how he described Helen. She had this laugh, he said, staring off into the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. Like wind chimes in a summer breeze, and these green eyes that sparkled when she was happy. Used to wear this little silver locket her grandmother gave her, never took it off. The specificity of his descriptions made me uncomfortable. How could he know these intimate details about a girl who disappeared decades ago? When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said he'd done a lot of research about the house's history. I found photo albums upstairs, old letters, that kind of thing. The family left a lot behind when they fled, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right with me. The way he talked about Helen wasn't like reading about a stranger. It was like he was remembering someone he'd actually known. Around midnight, Teddy offered to show me where he'd found those newspaper clippings. There's a whole room upstairs where the father kept everything, he said, grabbing the lantern. Police reports, newspaper articles, even some of Helen's personal things. It's like a shrine to what happened. I should have said no. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to go back to my car and deal with my family problems like a normal person. But I was 21 and curious, and the combination of those things has gotten me into trouble more times than I can count. We climbed this rickety staircase that groaned under our weight, and with each step, the air seemed to get thicker, more oppressive. The second floor was even more deteriorated than the first, with wallpaper peeling off in long strips and floorboards that sagged in places. Teddy led me to a room at the end of the hall, and when he pushed open the door, I saw what he meant. The room was like stepping into a madman's obsession. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, all yellowed and brittle with age, but arranged in this meticulous timeline. Photos of Helen were scattered among the articles, school pictures, family portraits, candid shots of her at the beach. But what made my skin crawl was that some of the photos looked more recent than 1978. They were Polaroids, and the quality was different, grainier. In these newer photos, Helen was wearing different clothes. Her hair was styled differently, and she looked scared, terrified actually. There was one photo where she was clearly trying to cover her face with her hands, like she didn't want to be photographed. Teddy was watching me carefully as I examined everything, and when I pointed out the inconsistency in the photo dates, he just smiled this cold, empty smile. "Time plays tricks in old houses like this," he said. "Sometimes the past and present get all mixed up." That's when I noticed the silver locket sitting on a small table beneath one of the newspaper clippings. The same locket Teddy had described in such detail earlier. It was tarnished black, but I could still make out an engraved H on the front. My heart started racing, and suddenly all the pieces were clicking into place in the worst possible way. I picked up the locket, and Teddy's entire demeanor changed. His friendly storytelling voice disappeared, replaced by something flat and dangerous. "You shouldn't touch that," he said quietly. "It doesn't belong to you." When I asked him how he really knew so much about Helen, how he had these personal items, he just stared at me for a long moment. Then he started laughing, this horrible sound that echoed off the walls. "I've been taking care of Helen for a very long time," he said. "She's been my special friend since 1978. We have such wonderful conversations together." The way he said friend made my stomach turn, and that's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere in the walls. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone trying to communicate. Teddy heard it too, and his pale eyes lit up with this sick excitement. "Oh, she knows we're talking about her," he whispered. Helen always gets restless when strangers are in her house. He moved toward a section of the wall where the scratching was loudest, and I watched in horror as he pressed his ear against the faded wallpaper. "Shh, shh, it's okay," he murmured to the wall like he was comforting a pet. "Daddy's here. The nice boy just wanted to hear your story." That's when the full nightmare of the situation hit me. This wasn't some squatter who'd found old newspaper clippings. This was Helen's killer, and somehow, impossibly, she was still alive in this house. I clutched the locket tighter and started backing toward the door, but Teddy was watching me with those bright, predatory eyes. "Where are you going, Jake?" he asked softly. "Don't you want to meet Helen properly? She's been so lonely all these years. I think she'd really like a young friend like you." I ran, not just out of that room, but out of that entire cursed house. I stumbled down those stairs in the dark, crashed through the kitchen, and burst out that side door like my life depended on it, which it probably did. Behind me, I could hear Teddy calling my name, but his voice sounded different, older somehow, like it was coming from a much deeper place. I got to my car and my hands were trembling so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of there, I looked back at the house one last time, and I swear I saw two figures silhouetted in that upstairs window, one tall and one smaller, watching me leave. I drove straight to the police station in Carpinteria and told them everything. They sent officers to check the house the next day, but they said it was empty. No sign of anyone living there, no camping equipment, no newspaper clippings. Just an abandoned house full of rot and old memories. But they did find something in that upstairs room. Scratches in the walls, deep gouges that looked fresh. The officer I spoke with said they'd probably been made by raccoons or other animals. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. That was 3 months ago, and I still drive past that house sometimes, just to make sure it's still boarded up. Because part of me wonders if Teddy is still in there, keeping Helen company in whatever twisted way he has been for all these years. Growing up in Cedar Ridge, Michigan, my sister Lily and I always heard whispers about Wonderland Park. The place had been our favorite summer hangout until everything changed in 2006, when 7-year-old Tommy Brennan vanished during the 4th of July celebration. After that, the whole fairground shut down overnight, leaving behind rusted rides and peeling paint. When Lily and I returned home for our grandmother's funeral last spring, we hadn't planned on visiting that cursed place. But grief does strange things to people, and we found ourselves driving past the chain-link fence on a humid Thursday afternoon, remembering how Gran used to take us there for cotton candy and carousel rides. Lily was the one who suggested we sneak in, just for old times' sake. At 28, she still had that rebellious streak that got us into trouble as kids. I should have said no. At 31, I knew better. But standing there, looking at the faded keep out signs and remembering Gran's laugh as she watched us on the tilt-a-whirl, I couldn't resist. We found a gap in the fence near the old maintenance shed, where years of weather had bent the metal just enough for us to squeeze through. The moment we stepped onto the cracked asphalt, the air felt heavier, like the place was holding its breath. Weeds pushed through every surface, and the Ferris wheel loomed against the gray sky like a metal skeleton. We wandered past the carousel first, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop with their mouths open in silent screams. Some had missing eyes, others had their manes torn off by vandals or weather. The mirrors around the center column were mostly shattered, reflecting our distorted images in the remaining pieces. That's when Lily noticed the storage trailers lined up behind the game booths. Most were locked with heavy chains, but one door hung open, swaying slightly despite the still air. She headed straight for it while I lingered by a ring toss game, its stuffed prizes long rotted away. "Ashley, you gotta see this," she called out, her voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. The inside of the trailer shocked us both into silence. While everything else in the park looked decades abandoned, this space felt lived in. Fresh candy bar wrappers littered the floor, Snickers, Kit Kats, things that couldn't have been there since 2006. A Coleman lantern sat on a makeshift table made from plywood and cinder blocks. But what made my skin crawl were the children's clothes folded neatly in the corner. A small blue jacket, striped socks, a pair of light-up sneakers that looked brand new. Next to them sat a teddy bear with one eye missing, its fur matted but clean. Lily picked up a notebook from the table, and her face went pale as she flipped through pages filled with childish drawings of Ferris wheels and carousel horses. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, grabbing her arm. But she was fixated on something else, a Polaroid taped to the wall showing a young boy standing in front of the carousel. The photo looked recent, the colors too vivid to be from 2006. The boy wore the same blue jacket we'd found folded in the corner. As we backed toward the door, we heard it, the distant sound of carousel music playing somewhere in the park. Not a recording, but the actual mechanical notes of the old calliope that hadn't worked in 17 years. The melody was wrong though, playing at half speed like a music box winding down. Lily dropped the notebook and we both bolted from the trailer. Running through the fairground felt like moving through molasses. Every turn looked the same. Rows of abandoned game booths, their awnings flapping in a wind we couldn't feel. The carousel music followed us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always that same slowed-down version of "Pop Goes the Weasel." We passed the funhouse and I swear I saw movement in the broken mirrors, shapes that didn't match our reflections. When we finally reached the spot where we'd entered, the gap in the fence was gone. Someone had wired it shut with fresh metal ties that gleamed silver against the rust. Lily started pulling at the fence desperately while I scanned for another exit, trying to ignore the sound of footsteps on gravel getting closer. That's when we saw him, a man in faded overalls emerging from behind the ticket booth. He must have been in his 60s, with stringy gray hair and eyes that never seemed to blink. In his arms, he carried a mannequin dressed like a child, complete with the blue jacket from the trailer. He walked past us like we weren't even there, heading toward the carousel with measured steps. The mannequin's head lolled unnaturally, and I realized with horror that he'd drawn a face on it with markers, giving it rosy cheeks and a crooked smile. He placed it carefully on one of the carousel horses, adjusting its position like a photographer setting up a shot. Then he turned to us, and his lips moved silently, mouthing words we couldn't hear over the grinding music. Lily found a weakness in the fence near the old restroom building, a section where the posts had rotted at the base. We kicked at it frantically while the man began walking toward us, still carrying that horrible mannequin. He moved slowly but deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. The wood finally gave way with a crack that echoed across the empty park. We squeezed through just as his fingers brushed Lily's shoulder, leaving dirty streaks on her jacket. Once outside, we ran to my car without looking back, but in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing at the fence, cradling his mannequin and watching us leave. The carousel music had stopped, but somehow that silence felt worse than the distorted melody. We drove straight to the police station, our story tumbling out in fragments. The officer taking our report looked skeptical until we mentioned the fresh supplies and children's clothes. His expression changed completely when I described the man with the mannequin. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into a back office. He returned with a detective named Burgess who had worked the original Tommy Brennan case. Burgess showed us a photo from 2006, a maintenance worker named Walter Cray, who'd been questioned but never charged. It was the same man, barely aged despite the 17 years. "Cray disappeared right after we released him," Burgess said. "We've been looking for him ever since." They organized a search team immediately, but when they reached Wonderland Park 3 hours later, the trailer was empty. No clothes, no wrappers, no notebook with children's drawings. Even the gap we'd made in the fence had been repaired with old wood that looked like it had been there for years. The only evidence of our encounter was the dirt on Lily's jacket and a single Polaroid they found stuck in the fence wire. Not the one from the trailer, but a new one showing 2 women running through the fairground. Neither of us remembered anyone taking our picture. The police kept the investigation open, posted extra patrols around the park, but Walter Cray had vanished again like smoke. 6 months have passed since that day, and they finally tore down Wonderland Park last month. The demolition crew found a network of tunnels underneath the fairground that nobody knew existed, maintenance access that had been expanded into living spaces. They discovered more children's clothes, hundreds of Polaroids dating back decades, and detailed journals where Cray had been recreating the day Tommy Brennan disappeared over and over again. He'd been living there the entire time, surfacing only to gather supplies and stage his twisted reenactments. They never found Cray himself, but at least they found Tommy. His remains were in a sealed room beneath the carousel, along with those of 3 other children who'd gone missing from neighboring towns over the years. Their families finally got closure, and the police believe Cray fled the state when he realized we'd discovered his hideout. Lily and I don't talk about what we saw that day, but sometimes she'll call me late at night when she can't sleep. We both still dream about that slowed-down carousel music, and the man with his mannequin child. The detective told us we were lucky. If we'd arrived an hour later after dark, we might have become part of his collection. I drive past the empty lot where Wonderland Park used to stand sometimes, and I always speed up, never stopping, never looking too closely at the shadows. They built a memorial garden there for the children, with bright flowers and a small playground. It's beautiful in the daylight, full of laughter and life, but I know what was underneath, and I know that somewhere out there, Walter Cray is probably setting up his sick puppet show in another abandoned place, waiting for curious visitors to wander in. There are things that happen to us as kids that we carry for the rest of our lives, and what I'm about to tell happened in the summer of 1987 when I was 16. I'm posting this here because I can't keep it inside anymore, and maybe somebody will understand why I've been haunted by this for 35 years. At the time, I was just another bored teenager in a small Pennsylvania town, spending my days with 3 other guys who were as restless and stupid as I was. We called ourselves friends, but really we were just kids who'd found each other through proximity and shared mischief. The summer heat was brutal that year, the kind that makes you feel like you're breathing through wet cotton, and we were desperate for something, anything to break the monotony of our dead-end town. That's when someone brought up the Riverside Sanatorium, an abandoned tuberculosis hospital that had been sitting empty on the edge of town for nearly 20 years. The building was massive, a 5-story brick monstrosity that loomed against the sky like something out of a horror movie. It had been built in the 1940s to treat TB patients, back when they thought fresh air and isolation could cure the disease. By the time they shut it down in 1968, hundreds of people had died within those walls, and the whole place had this reputation for being cursed or haunted, or whatever teenagers tell each other to make themselves feel braver. We'd driven past it countless times, always slowing down to stare at the boarded windows and the chain-link fence that surrounded the property. The city had put up no trespassing signs everywhere, but that only made it more appealing to us. We'd heard stories from older kids about strange sounds coming from inside, about lights flickering in windows that shouldn't have electricity, about people going in and coming out changed. Most of it was probably bullshit, but there was something about that place that made even the toughest kids in our school speak in whispers when they talked about it. It was Kevin who finally suggested we actually go inside. Kevin was the unofficial leader of our group, tall, athletic, with this cocky grin that made teachers hate him and girls swoon. He had this way of making everything sound like an adventure instead of the stupid, dangerous shit it actually was. We were hanging out at the old railroad tracks behind the grocery store, sharing a warm can of Coke and complaining about how boring everything was, when he just blurted it out. We should break into the sanatorium. The rest of us, me, Bobby, and Chris, just stared at him like he'd suggested we rob a bank. Bobby was the nervous one, always chewing his fingernails and worrying about getting in trouble. Chris was the quiet type, built like a scarecrow but surprisingly brave when it came down to it. And me? I was the one who always went along with whatever Kevin suggested, even when every instinct in my body screamed that it was a terrible idea. That's exactly what happened that day. My gut was telling me to suggest we go to the arcade instead, but I didn't want to look like a coward in front of the others. The plan was simple, or at least it seemed that way at the time. We'd ride our bikes to the sanatorium after dark, find a way through the fence and explore the first floor for maybe an hour. Just enough to say we'd done it. Maybe take some pictures to prove it to the other kids at school. Kevin had this cheap disposable camera he'd been carrying around all summer, and he was convinced that getting photos inside the abandoned hospital would make us legends. We agreed to meet at the old water tower at 9 p.m. when our parents would think we were just hanging out somewhere safe and boring. The rest of that day dragged by like molasses, and I kept finding excuses to back out. Maybe I was getting sick. Maybe my parents needed help with something. Maybe we should wait until the weekend. But every time I started to voice my doubts, Kevin would give me this look like I was disappointing him, and I'd swallow my words. By the time evening rolled around, I was committed, even though my stomach was churning with anxiety that I mistook for excitement. When we met up that night, the temperature had barely dropped from the sweltering heat of the day. The air was thick and humid, and mosquitoes buzzed around us like tiny vampires. We rode our bikes through the empty streets, past houses where families were settling down for the night, past the closed shops and darkened storefronts of our sleepy downtown. The sanatorium sat about 2 miles outside the main part of town, on a hill that overlooked the valley where most of us lived. As we got closer, pedaling up the winding road that led to the facility, I could see the building's silhouette against the star-filled sky. It was even more imposing in the darkness, like a sleeping giant that we were about to wake up. The chain-link fence was 8 feet tall and topped with rusty barbed wire, but Kevin had done his homework. He'd found a section where the fence had been cut, probably by other kids who'd had the same brilliant idea we were having. We squeezed through the gap one by one, our bikes clanging against the metal as we pushed them through. The grounds surrounding the sanatorium were overgrown with weeds and scrub brush that reached our waists in some places. Old concrete walkways cracked and broken by tree roots led toward the main entrance, but we could barely see them in the dim light from the quarter moon. The air smelled different here, not just the usual summer sense of cut grass and barbecue smoke, but something else, something medicinal and stale that seemed to seep from the building itself. We left our bikes hidden in a cluster of bushes near the fence and approached the main entrance on foot. The massive wooden doors were secured with heavy chains and padlocks, but Kevin had anticipated this too. He led us around to the side of the building, where a loading dock had been built for deliveries back when the place was operational. One of the metal doors was hanging slightly ajar, held open by a thick vine that had grown through the gap. The opening was just wide enough for us to squeeze through, and before any of us could change our minds, Kevin slipped inside. The moment we stepped into that building, everything changed. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, and the air became thick and oppressive, like breathing through a wet blanket. Our flashlights cut weak beams through the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor lined with peeling paint and water stains that looked like dark bruises on the walls. The floor was covered with debris, chunks of plaster, broken glass, and things I didn't want to identify. Every step we took echoed through the empty space, and I kept waiting for someone to tell us to stop, to turn around and go home. But Kevin was already moving deeper into the building, his flashlight sweeping back and forth like he was hunting for treasure. Bobby was right behind him, trying to act brave, but I could hear his breathing getting faster and more shallow. Chris brought up the rear, his flashlight pointed down at the floor like he was afraid of what he might see if he looked up. We made our way through what must have been the main hallway, past doorways that opened into rooms so dark our flashlights couldn't penetrate them. The first thing that really got to me was the smell. It wasn't just musty or moldy like you'd expect in an abandoned building. It was something deeper, something that seemed to cling to the back of your throat and make you want to gag. It reminded me of the time my grandmother had been sick, that antiseptic hospital smell, mixed with something else, something human and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. Kevin was getting bolder as we went, pushing open doors and calling out, "Hello?" in a loud voice that made the rest of us cringe. He was treating it like a game, but there was an edge to his voice that told me he was just as nervous as the rest of us. We explored what looked like old patient rooms, still containing rusted bed frames and metal cabinets with their doors hanging open. In one room, someone had spray-painted "Get Out" in red letters across the wall, and Bobby made a joke about it that nobody laughed at. The deeper we went into the building, the more I wanted to turn around and run back to our bikes. We'd been inside for maybe 30 minutes when Kevin found the stairwell that led to the basement. The door was heavy wood, painted institutional green, and it creaked like something from a horror movie when he pulled it open. A wave of even colder air rushed up from below, carrying with it a smell that was 10 times worse than what we'd been dealing with upstairs. It was like decay and chemicals and something sweet that made my stomach turn. Bobby immediately said, "No way," and Chris nodded in agreement, but Kevin was already shining his flashlight down the concrete steps. "Come on, don't be babies," he said, but his voice wasn't as confident as usual. "We've come this far. Let's just check out one room down there and then we'll leave." I should have backed Bobby and Chris up, should have insisted we get out of there, but something in Kevin's tone made me feel like I had to prove myself. Before I knew it, I was agreeing to go downstairs with him while the other two waited by the stairwell door. It was the stupidest decision I've ever made in my life. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms that must have been used for storage or maintenance when the hospital was operational. Our footsteps echoed differently down there, muffled and strange, like the sound was being absorbed by the walls themselves. Kevin kept taking pictures with his disposable camera, the flash creating brief, blinding moments of stark white light that made everything look even more sinister. We found rooms full of old medical equipment, wheelchairs with leather straps, metal tables with restraints, glass cabinets that had once held instruments I didn't want to think about. In one room, we discovered a pile of patient records that had been left behind, yellowed papers with names and dates from the 1950s and 60s. Kevin was fascinated by them, reading off names of people who had died decades ago while I stood in the doorway wishing we'd never come down here. The temperature seemed to keep dropping the deeper we went, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in the beam of my flashlight. That's when Kevin spotted the door at the end of the corridor, a door that looked different from all the others, newer somehow, like it had been installed long after the hospital had closed. The door was solid steel, painted a dull gray that looked almost black in our flashlight beams. There was no handle on our side, just a heavy deadbolt that had been installed from the outside. Kevin immediately started trying to figure out how to open it, running his hands along the frame and looking for any weakness. "This has to lead somewhere important," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "Why else would they seal it up like this?" I told him we should head back upstairs, that Bobby and Chris were probably getting worried, but he wasn't listening. He'd found a piece of metal pipe in one of the storage rooms and was using it to pry at the door frame. The sound of metal scraping against metal was incredibly loud in the confined space, and I kept expecting someone to come running to see what we were doing. After what felt like forever, the door finally gave way with a loud crack that made both of us jump. Kevin pushed it open and shined his flashlight inside, revealing a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of our lights. The air that came out was different from the rest of the basement, warmer, almost tropical, with a humidity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Holy shit," Kevin whispered, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "This has to be some kind of service tunnel. Maybe it connects to other buildings or leads to the old power plant." Before I could stop him, he stepped into the tunnel, his flashlight beam disappearing into the darkness ahead. I called after him, told him to wait, but he was already moving away from me. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, with brick walls that seemed to close in the farther you went. I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and get Bobby and Chris and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't leave Kevin alone, and I couldn't face the others if something happened to him while I was standing there like a coward. The tunnel sloped downward, and the air got thicker and more humid with each step. The walls were covered with a thin layer of moisture that made them gleam in the flashlight beam, and I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere ahead. Kevin's voice echoed back to me from the darkness. "There's something down here, some kind of room." Those were the last words I ever heard him say. I waited for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, calling his name into the tunnel and getting nothing back but my own echo. The silence was absolute and terrifying. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and ran back through the basement up the stairs and found Bobby and Chris exactly where we'd left them. They could see the panic on my face immediately. When I told them what happened, Bobby started hyperventilating and Chris just kept repeating, "We have to call someone, we have to call someone." But what were we going to tell the police? That we'd broken into an abandoned building and lost our friend in some hidden tunnel? We spent the next 4 hours searching for Kevin, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. When the sun came up, we finally went to the authorities and told them a carefully edited version of the story, that Kevin had dared us to meet him at the sanatorium, and when we got there, he was nowhere to be found. The search teams that came out found no trace of him, no tunnel, nothing. The steel door I remembered was gone, sealed behind a brick wall that looked like it had been there for decades. The case went cold after 3 months. Kevin's parents never stopped believing he'd run away, maybe hitchhiked to California or something. The three of us never spoke about what really happened, and eventually we drifted apart, unable to look at each other without remembering that night. I moved away for college and tried to forget, but Kevin haunted my dreams for years. Then, in 2019, I got a call from Chris. The city had finally decided to demolish the old sanatorium to make way for a shopping center. During the demolition, they'd found human remains sealed inside a maintenance tunnel that had been bricked off from the inside. The bones were identified as Kevin's through dental records. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death. There were no signs of trauma, no evidence of how he'd died, or how he'd ended up in that tunnel. The case was officially reopened, and the three of us had to give new statements, but we stuck to our original story. Some things are better left buried, even when the truth finally comes to light. I still don't understand what happened in that tunnel, and I never will, but I know that whatever Kevin found down there in the darkness, it wasn't meant for the living. So I work as a freelance photographer, and February 2022 was supposed to be my big break. I'd landed this assignment with National Geographic to capture the northern lights in Alaska's wilderness, something I'd been dreaming about since college. At 31, I was finally getting recognition for my work, and this trip felt like validation of all those years sleeping in my beat-up Ford Explorer, chasing perfect shots across the country. I'd been planning this expedition for months, studying weather patterns, mapping out remote locations where light pollution wouldn't interfere with my shots. The plan was simple: drive the Alaska Highway, stop at predetermined spots, and document the aurora borealis in its most pristine form. I'd done solo trips before, but nothing quite this isolated, nothing where the nearest town could be hundreds of miles away through unforgiving terrain. The morning I left Fairbanks, the weather forecast showed clear skies for the next week. Perfect conditions. I remember feeling this incredible mix of excitement and nervousness as I loaded my camera equipment into the Explorer, double-checking my supplies, extra batteries, emergency food, sleeping bag rated for -40, flares, and a satellite communicator that I'd rented specifically for this trip. The device was supposed to work anywhere, even in the most remote areas, giving me a direct line to emergency services if things went sideways. I'd tested it before leaving, sent a message to my editor confirming everything was working perfectly. The route I'd planned would take me through some of the most beautiful and dangerous wilderness in North America, but I felt prepared. I'd researched every mile, marked potential camping spots, and even identified a few abandoned structures along the way where I could take shelter if needed. What I didn't account for was how quickly everything could go wrong in a place where civilization feels like a distant memory. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I captured some incredible shots near Denali, the kind of photos that make your portfolio stand out. The aurora activity was intense, dancing across the sky in ways that made me forget about the bitter cold seeping through my gear. I was averaging about 2 hours of sleep each night, too wired from the adrenaline and the beauty of what I was witnessing. By day 4, I was heading toward a more remote location I'd marked on my map, a spot about 60 miles from the nearest road maintenance station. The temperature had dropped to -28, and my Explorer was handling it like a champ, the engine purring steadily as I navigated the winding mountain road. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just me and the wilderness. No cell towers, no traffic, no human noise for miles. The silence was so complete it felt almost sacred, broken only by the crunch of snow under my tires and the occasional crack of ice settling in the distance. Then the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, like someone had flipped a switch on the weather. One moment I was driving under clear skies, and the next I was in a complete whiteout, snow coming down so thick I couldn't see the hood of my car. The wind was howling like something alive and angry, rocking the Explorer back and forth as I tried to maintain control. I slowed to a crawl, hazard lights flashing, following the barely visible tire tracks in the snow that marked the road. My GPS was useless in this terrain, showing nothing but blank space, and the satellite communicator couldn't get a signal through the storm. I drove for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, inching forward, when I felt the rear wheels start to slip. The road had vanished completely under a fresh drift, and before I could react, the Explorer slid sideways into a snowbank that must have been 4 feet deep. The engine died, and suddenly the only sound was the wind trying to tear my car apart. I tried everything to get unstuck, rocking the car back and forth, digging around the wheels with my hands until they went numb, even putting my floor mats under the tires for traction. Nothing worked. The snow kept falling and I realized I was in serious trouble. The temperature was dropping fast, and staying in the car overnight would be suicide once the engine heat dissipated. I'd read enough survival stories to know that people die in situations exactly like this, freezing to death just yards from safety they never knew existed. I grabbed my emergency pack, the satellite communicator, and my camera gear, then started walking. The storm was so intense I could barely see my own feet, but I figured if I followed what I thought was the road, I might find some kind of shelter, or at least a spot that blocked the wind. Every step was a battle against the snow trying to swallow my boots, and the cold was so brutal, it felt like needles stabbing through my jacket. After about 20 minutes of trudging through knee-deep drifts, I was starting to panic when I saw it through the swirling snow. A dark shape that looked man-made. It was a cabin, set back about 50 yards from what must have been the road. Old, weathered wood siding, a metal roof partially collapsed on one side and windows so dirty they looked black. A hand-painted sign hung crooked next to the door. Private property, no trespassing. But there was smoke coming from the chimney, thin and gray against the white sky, which meant someone was inside and the place had heat. I didn't care about trespassing laws at that point. I was gonna die out here if I didn't get warm soon. My feet were already losing feeling, and ice was forming in my beard from my breath. I approached the front door, noting how the porch steps were rotting and covered in a thick layer of undisturbed snow, except for a single set of footprints leading to the door. They looked old, maybe a day or two, already partially filled in. I knocked hard, calling out that I was stranded and needed help, but got no response. The wind was howling so loud I wasn't sure anyone inside could hear me anyway. I tried the door handle and it turned easily. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a mix of stale cigarettes, unwashed clothes, and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and unpleasant. The cabin was dim, lit only by a dying fire in a stone fireplace and what little gray light filtered through the grimy windows. I called out again, louder this time, but still no answer. The place was a mess. Empty beer cans scattered across a wooden table, dirty dishes piled in a sink with no running water, and clothes thrown everywhere. But what really caught my attention was the man lying on a ratty couch near the fireplace. He was unconscious, face down, wearing a thick flannel shirt and jeans, dark hair matted with what looked like dried blood. His breathing was shallow but steady, and I could see a nasty gash on the back of his head that had crusted over. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, but the guy looked like he needed medical attention, and I couldn't just walk away from someone who might be dying. I closed the door behind me to keep the heat in and approached him carefully. The closer I got, the more I noticed things that made me uneasy. There were dark stains on the wooden floor that looked suspiciously like blood, and they formed a trail leading from the kitchen area to where the man was lying. The furniture was overturned in places, a lamp was broken on the floor, and there were what looked like bullet holes in the far wall. This wasn't just someone who'd had an accident. This was the aftermath of something violent. I knelt beside the couch and gently shook the man's shoulder, calling out to see if he was responsive. His skin was cold but not freezing, and when I checked his pulse, it was weak but present. I was reaching for my phone to call for help when I remembered there was no signal out here, and my satellite communicator was in my pack. As I started to stand up to get it, the man's eyes suddenly snapped open. They were bloodshot and wild, darting around the room before focusing on me with an intensity that made my spine tingle. He didn't look grateful or confused like someone who'd just been helped. He looked angry, calculating, like a predator that had just spotted prey. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, his voice rough and gravelly. Before I could answer, he was sitting up, moving faster than someone with a head injury should be able to. "What are you doing in my cabin?" I started to explain about the storm in my car, but he cut me off with a harsh laugh that made my skin crawl. "Your cabin?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought you might need help. You were unconscious and bleeding." He touched the back of his head, wincing, then looked at his fingers. "Yeah, well, the old man who owned this place won't be needing it anymore." The way he said it, with that cold, matter-of-fact tone, made the hair on my arm stand up. I glanced around the cabin again, seeing the bloodstains and destruction with new eyes. This wasn't the scene of an accident or a medical emergency. This was a crime scene, and I was standing in it with the perpetrator. "Listen," I said, backing toward the door slowly. "I'm just going to head back to my car and wait out the storm. I don't want any trouble." He stood up from the couch, and I got a better look at him. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a scraggly beard and scars on his knuckles that suggested he was no stranger to violence. His clothes were filthy, and there was a wild look in his eyes that reminded me of cornered animals I'd photographed in the wilderness. "You're not going anywhere," he said, reaching behind his back and pulling out a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. "You've seen too much already." That's when I noticed the wallet on the table, open to show a driver's license with a photo of an elderly man with kind eyes and a gray beard. The name read Daniel Hartwell, and the address was for this exact location. The man standing in front of me definitely wasn't Daniel Hartwell. "Look, I don't know what happened here," I said, raising my hands to show I wasn't a threat. "But I'm not going to say anything to anyone. I just want to get back to my car and leave." He shook his head, advancing toward me with the knife held low and ready. "That's what they all say. But you know what? Dead men tell no tales." The phrase sounded rehearsed, like he'd said it before, and that thought terrified me more than anything else that had happened so far. I lunged for the door, but he was faster than I expected. The knife slashed across my left shoulder as I twisted away, slicing through my jacket and into flesh. The pain was immediate and sharp, but adrenaline kept me moving. I threw my weight against the door and burst outside into the howling storm, the cold hitting my face like a slap. Behind me, I could hear him cursing and scrambling to follow. I ran into the woods beside the cabin, my boots slipping on the icy ground, branches whipping across my face as I pushed through the undergrowth. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 3 feet ahead, but I kept running, knowing that stopping meant death. I could hear him behind me crashing through the trees, shouting threats that the wind carried away. My shoulder was burning and I could feel warm blood soaking into my shirt, but I didn't dare stop to assess the damage. The forest was dense and dark, and I quickly lost any sense of direction, but at least the thick canopy overhead was blocking some of the snow. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I couldn't hear him anymore. I found a fallen log and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath and figure out my next move. The cut on my shoulder wasn't deep enough to be life-threatening, but it was bleeding steadily and the cold was making it throb. I pulled out my satellite communicator with numb fingers and tried to get a signal, but the storm was still interfering with the connection. I knew I had to keep moving to stay warm, but I was completely lost in a blizzard with a killer somewhere behind me. That's when I remembered something from my research. There was supposed to be a ranger station about 5 miles northeast of this area. If I could find it, I'd have shelter and a way to contact help. I used my compass to get a bearing and started walking, leaving the deepest tracks I could in the snow so searchers might be able to follow them later. Every step was agony, but I kept thinking about that wallet, about Daniel Hartwell's kind face, and how this psychopath had probably killed him in cold blood. I wasn't going to become another victim if I could help it. The storm finally started to clear around dawn, and I saw smoke rising in the distance. It was the ranger station, and I'd never been so happy to see a building in my life. The summer I turned 17 was probably the most boring 3 months of my entire life. Here I was, stuck in rural Vermont with absolutely nothing to do except help my dad at his auto repair shop or sit around the house watching Netflix. Most of my friends had gotten jobs at the local diner or were helping their families with farm work, and I was going stir-crazy waiting for senior year to start. My parents weren't exactly rolling in money. Mom worked as a secretary at the county courthouse, and Dad's little repair shop barely kept us afloat. But they were good people who trusted me to make decent choices. Our town was one of those places where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the most exciting thing that happened all year was when the high school football team made it to regionals. That's why when my friend Lucas called me up one night in late August and suggested we explore the old Riverside Rehabilitation Center, I jumped at the chance. The place had been shut down for about 5 years after some scandal involving patient mistreatment, and it sat about 15 miles outside of town, surrounded by thick woods and basically forgotten by the world. The plan seemed harmless enough. Meet up around midnight, pile into Lucas's beat-up Ford pickup, and spend a few hours exploring the abandoned building with flashlights. Besides Lucas and me, there was also Megan, who had been dating Lucas since sophomore year, and her younger brother Tyler, who was always trying to prove he was mature enough to hang with us older kids. We'd all heard the typical small-town rumors about the place: mysterious patient deaths, illegal experiments, the usual ghost stories that get passed around when a building sits empty long enough. But honestly, we were just 4 bored teenagers desperate for some excitement and maybe some cool photos to post on social media. The building itself was this massive 3-story brick structure that must have been impressive back in the 1960s when it was first built. But now it just stood there like a monument to neglect. Broken windows lined every floor, graffiti covered the lower walls, and weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot, making the whole place feel like something straight out of a horror movie. None of us had any idea that our little adventure would turn into the most terrifying night of our lives. We met up at the old gas station on Route 7 just before midnight, and I could tell everyone was excited, but trying to play it cool. Tyler kept cracking jokes about ghosts and trying to scare Megan, while Lucas checked his backpack for the 3rd time to make sure he had enough batteries for the flashlights. The drive out there was pretty quiet, just the sound of gravel crunching under the tires and some classic rock playing softly on the radio. When we finally pulled into the overgrown parking lot, the headlights illuminated the front entrance, and I swear the place seemed even more intimidating than I remembered from driving past it during the day. The main doors were chained shut, but Lucas had done his homework and knew about a side entrance near the loading dock where some of the boards had been pried loose. We parked behind some overgrown bushes to hide the truck from the main road, grabbed our flashlights, and made our way around to the side of the building. The night air was thick with humidity, and I could hear crickets chirping from the woods that surrounded the property on 3 sides. The side entrance was exactly where Lucas said it would be. A door marked "Staff Only," with plywood covering the windows and a couple of loose boards that we could easily move aside. Tyler went first, squeezing through the gap and disappearing into the darkness, followed by Megan, who was trying to act brave but kept glancing back at us nervously. Lucas held the boards while I climbed through, and then he followed behind us, letting the boards fall back into place. The moment we were inside, the temperature seemed to drop about 10 degrees, and this musty smell hit us, like wet cardboard mixed with something medicinal that made my nose wrinkle. We were in what used to be a storage room, with empty metal shelving units lining the walls and scattered papers covering the floor. Tyler was already shining his flashlight around, illuminating water stains on the ceiling and graffiti that other trespassers had left behind. The beam of light caught something that made us all pause: fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, way too recent to have been left by whoever had broken in here months or years ago. "Probably just some other kids who came through here recently," Lucas whispered, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We decided to stick together and headed deeper into the building, following a long hallway that stretched toward what used to be the main reception area. Our flashlights created these eerie shadows that danced on the walls as we walked, and every small sound seemed amplified in the empty space. The hallway was lined with doors that hung open, revealing patient rooms stripped bare of everything, except the occasional broken chair or scattered medical equipment. About halfway down the hall, Megan grabbed my arm and pointed her flashlight toward one of the rooms. There, spread out on the floor, was what appeared to be a makeshift bed, a sleeping bag, some folded clothes, and a couple of empty water bottles arranged neatly in the corner. The sleeping bag was unzipped and the pillow still had an indentation in it, like someone had been lying there recently. Tyler started to step into the room to get a closer view, but Lucas grabbed his shoulder and shook his head. We all stood there in silence for a moment, the reality of the situation starting to sink in. "We should probably leave," Megan whispered, but Tyler was already moving toward the next room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What we found in that room made my heart start pounding in my chest. Someone had set up what appeared to be a small kitchen area using camping equipment, a portable gas stove, canned goods stacked in neat rows, and a cooler that was still humming quietly. The scariest part was that there was a can of soup sitting open on a makeshift table, with a spoon still in it, and when Tyler reached out to touch the can, he jerked his hand back like he'd been burned. The soup was still warm. We all stared at each other with the same thought running through our minds. Whoever was living here wasn't just nearby. They were probably still in the building. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from somewhere above us, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. The footsteps stopped directly above our heads, and we could hear the old floorboards creaking under someone's weight. Tyler's flashlight beam started shaking as he pointed it toward the ceiling, and Megan moved closer to Lucas, her breathing becoming short and rapid. Lucas motioned for us to move back toward the hallway, and we started creeping in that direction as quietly as possible. But as we reached the doorway, we heard something that made us all freeze in place, the unmistakable sound of multiple footsteps, not just one person, moving around upstairs. They seemed to be moving in a pattern, like they were searching for something or following a specific route through the building. Even worse, we could hear what sounded like muffled voices, too distant to make out words, but definitely human. Tyler was the first to break, whispering frantically that we needed to get out of there immediately, but Lucas held up his hand and pointed down the hallway. At the far end, near where we thought the main staircase should be, we could see a faint glow, not from a flashlight, but from what appeared to be actual electric lighting. The building was supposed to have been without power for years, but someone had clearly found a way to get electricity running in at least part of the structure. The voices upstairs were getting louder, and we could hear what sounded like furniture being moved around, like they were rearranging things or searching through rooms. We huddled together in the doorway, trying to decide whether to make a run for the exit or find somewhere to hide until whoever was upstairs moved to a different part of the building. That's when Tyler pointed his flashlight down a side corridor that we hadn't noticed before, revealing a sign that read, "Basement Access," with an arrow pointing toward a staircase going down. Lucas shook his head immediately, but the footsteps above us were getting closer to what sounded like the main staircase. and we realized we might not have a choice. The basement seemed like our best option for hiding until we could figure out a way to get back to the exit safely. We moved as quietly as possible down the side corridor, our flashlights creating dancing shadows on the walls that made everything seem even more sinister. The staircase was narrow and made of concrete, with metal railings that were cold to the touch and slightly damp from condensation. As we descended, the air got thicker and more humid, and that medicinal smell became mixed with something else, something that reminded me of a locker room that hadn't been cleaned in months. About halfway down the stairs, we heard the voices from upstairs getting much louder, and it became clear that whoever was up there had realized they weren't alone in the building. The basement was even more unsettling than the upper floors. Our flashlights revealed a maze of corridors lined with what must have been treatment rooms, each one containing rusted medical equipment and examination tables covered in years of dust and grime. But what really caught our attention were the obvious signs that someone had been spending time down here recently. In one room, we found a makeshift workshop with tools arranged on a metal table, and in another, there were stacks of old patient files that had been sorted into neat piles. The most disturbing discovery was a room that appeared to be some kind of observation area, with multiple monitors connected to what looked like a jury-rigged security system. The screens were dark, but the equipment was clearly operational, with little LED lights blinking in the darkness. Tyler whispered that he could see camera cables running along the ceiling, disappearing into holes that had been drilled through the concrete walls. We realized with growing horror that whoever was living here had been watching the building, probably for weeks or months, and they almost certainly knew exactly where we were at that very moment. The sound of footsteps above us had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more terrifying than the noise had been. We were trying to decide which direction to go when we heard it. The sound of someone coming down the basement stairs, moving slowly and deliberately, like they were trying not to make noise but couldn't quite manage it. The footsteps were heavy, suggesting someone much larger than any of us, and they seemed to pause every few steps as if the person was listening for sounds from below. Lucas grabbed my arm and pointed toward what appeared to be a maintenance corridor that ran deeper into the basement, away from the staircase. We started moving in that direction, but we'd only gone about 20 feet when we heard a voice from the stairwell. A man's voice, rough and gravelly, calling out in a sing-song tone that made my skin crawl. He was saying something about visitors and how long it had been since he'd had company, and how he hoped we weren't planning to leave so soon. The voice echoed through the basement corridors, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was definitely getting closer. Megan was crying now, trying to muffle the sound with her hand, while Tyler kept glancing back toward the staircase like he was thinking about making a run for it. Lucas was the only one who seemed to be thinking clearly, and he motioned for us to keep moving deeper into the basement, away from the voice that was now humming some kind of melody that didn't sound like any song I'd ever heard. The maintenance corridor led us to what appeared to be the building's old boiler room, a large space filled with massive pipes and mechanical equipment that hadn't been used in years. But even here, we could see signs of recent activity. A chair positioned near one of the windows, empty food containers stacked in a corner, and what appeared to be a sleeping area set up behind the old boiler. The man's voice was getting closer, and we could hear him talking to himself now, muttering about protocols and procedures, and how the facility was still operational despite what the outside world believed. Lucas found a heavy metal door at the far end of the room marked emergency exit, but when he tried to open it, we discovered it had been welded shut from the inside. We were trapped, with no way out except back through the corridors where the man was still searching for us. That's when Tyler spotted something that gave us hope. A small window near the ceiling that appeared to lead to some kind of exterior well or drainage area. The window was partially broken, and we could see moonlight filtering through the gap. It was going to be a tight squeeze, especially for Lucas, who was the biggest of our group, but it might be our only chance to escape. We could hear the man's footsteps getting closer, and his voice was becoming more agitated, like he was frustrated that he couldn't find us. He started banging on pipes and kicking over equipment, the sound echoing through the basement like thunder. Lucas boosted Tyler up to the window first, and we watched as he squeezed through the broken glass and disappeared into the darkness outside. Megan went next, and I helped push her up while Lucas supported her from below. The man's voice was now coming from just outside the boiler room, and we could hear him trying different doors, getting closer to our hiding spot with each passing second. When it was my turn to climb up to the window, I could barely fit through the opening, and I ended up cutting my arm on the broken glass as I squeezed through. I landed in what appeared to be a concrete drainage well about 6 feet deep, with Tyler and Megan waiting to help me up. Lucas was having the most trouble. He was bigger than the rest of us, and the window opening was barely wide enough for his shoulders. We could hear the man enter the boiler room just as Lucas was halfway through the window, and the sound of his angry shouting filled the night air. Lucas finally made it through, but not before the man had seen him and started climbing on equipment to reach the window. We ran through the woods surrounding the building, branches scratching at our faces and arms until we reached the truck. Lucas's keys were shaking in his hand as he tried to start the engine, and we could see a flashlight beam moving around the building behind us. We drove away without saying a word, none of us able to process what had just happened. The next morning, Lucas called the police anonymously to report that someone was living in the abandoned building, but when they investigated, they found the place completely empty. No camping equipment, no security cameras, no sign that anyone had ever been there. To this day, I still have nightmares about that voice calling out in the darkness, and I've never been able to explain what we experienced that night. I hadn't been back to that side of town in over a decade. The trailer park was where I spent most of my childhood, tucked between a dried-up canal and the train tracks nobody used anymore. Back then, it was loud and messy, but full of life. People yelling across lots, kids riding rusted bikes, TVs blaring game shows through open windows. I left when I was 16, not by choice, but because my mom got evicted, and we bounced from couch to couch until we landed somewhere slightly more stable. Last month, I was driving back from visiting a friend in the hospital and made a split-second decision to turn down East Cypress Road. I don't know what I expected to see, maybe some piece of home still hanging on. But the entire place was gone. Most of the trailers had been torn out, and in their place was just a wasteland of cracked concrete, puddles full of mosquito larvae, and the remains of old fence posts. There were a few trailers still standing on the far end, crooked on their axles with busted-out windows and walls tattooed with graffiti. No signs, no crews, no fences, just silence and decay. I parked my car near where our old unit used to be. The number plate was long gone, but I still remembered the pattern of the bricks we laid as a front path. They were half buried in weeds now. I stood there longer than I should have, taking it all in. Then I saw one trailer, a couple of rows over, that didn't look as trashed as the rest. Curtains in the window, a plastic lawn chair, a broom propped against the door like someone had just used it. Curiosity got the better of me. I crossed over, stepping around old tires and scraps of metal. The trailer's door wasn't locked. I knocked once out of habit, then pushed it open. The air inside was thick, like stale sweat and old soup, but it wasn't empty. There were canned goods stacked neatly on the counter, a sleeping bag laid out on the floor, and an old radio sitting on a milk crate still tuned to some static-filled AM station. It looked like someone was squatting, but it wasn't trashed like you'd expect. Everything had its place. On the small table near the back there was a Polaroid photo, and that's when things started to twist. It was a picture of me and my mom sitting on our old porch, probably taken the summer before we were kicked out. I didn't remember anyone taking that photo. I stared at it for a long time, trying to place the angle, the moment, anything. It wasn't staged. I looked young, maybe 12, holding a popsicle with half of it already melting down my arm. My mom had her hair tied up in a red bandana, smiling at something off camera. The Polaroid had a fresh thumbprint smudge on the edge. Someone had touched it recently. I started feeling like I shouldn't be there. Not just in a this is someone else's space kind of way, but something more instinctual. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The broom was gone from outside. I jiggled the handle harder, called out, "Hello?" Nothing. That's when I realized it was getting dark outside. I pulled out my phone, but of course, no signal. I tried sending a text to my husband anyway, just in case it would go through later. I didn't want to start yelling yet. Something about the quiet felt contained, like sound wouldn't carry. I looked around the trailer again, slower this time. There was a half-eaten granola bar next to the sleeping bag. The radio had switched from static to faint voices, talking, maybe praying. I couldn't quite make it out. My skin prickled. The trailer didn't feel empty anymore. I walked to the back and tried the bathroom window, nailed shut from the outside. That's when I heard the click, soft but unmistakable, from one of the cabinets under the sink. I didn't want to move. I listened, holding my breath, as something shifted down there. Just a slight scraping sound, like fingers brushing the metal shelf. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the cabinet door. It didn't open, but whatever was behind it was aware of me now. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a plastic flashlight with no batteries, and started edging toward the door again. This time I didn't jiggle the handle. I slammed my shoulder into it, twice, hard. Nothing gave. The door held solid. I don't know what kind of lock they used, but it wasn't normal for these kinds of trailers. The cabinet creaked. I ran to the kitchen and shoved the table against the cabinet, then grabbed the broom that had reappeared by the door. It was leaning there again, like someone had returned it while I wasn't looking. I used the handle to wedge into the space between the door and frame, trying to pry it open. That's when I heard a man's voice behind me say, calm and quiet, "It's not safe out there." I turned around so fast I knocked the broom loose. But there was nobody. No one in the room. No one at the window. I stood in the center of that trailer, breathing like I'd just run a mile, waiting for footsteps or another sound. Anything. But all I could hear was the creaking of the frame as the wind picked up outside. I decided then I wasn't waiting around for whatever this was. I went into the small bedroom, yanked the window screen off, and kicked until the bottom frame bent enough for me to squeeze through. I crawled out into the dirt, scratched my arms on the way down and ran. I didn't even look back. I got to my car and slammed the door shut, locking it out of instinct. That trailer was just sitting there in the fading light, like nothing had happened, like it hadn't swallowed me for the last hour. I took one last look, and that's when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Someone standing in the window, holding the Polaroid. I drove straight to the sheriff's station. Didn't go home, didn't call anyone, just walked in with dirt on my clothes and panic still in my voice. I told them someone was living inside one of the condemned trailers, and that they had locked me in. The deputy on duty, a guy named Morris, didn't even blink. He just sighed and said, "Again?" Apparently, I wasn't the first person to report something strange out there. He radioed someone to check it out and asked me to wait. I tried to explain about the photo, but I could see it didn't matter. They'd written that place off long ago. Too many complaints, too much money to do anything about it. The next morning, Morris called me back. He said they sent someone out that night, but the trailer was empty. No sleeping bag, no food, no radio. Just an empty shell with broken cabinets and a warped floor. The Polaroid was gone too. He told me I probably ran into some drifter squatting, and that the area would be fully bulldozed within the next 2 weeks. Case closed. No follow-up. I asked if they had any way to know who'd been living there, if there were records or fingerprints. He gave me a look like I was wasting his time. "Ma'am, it's an abandoned trailer. No one's been legally on that property for years. But I know what I saw, and I know that photo wasn't just some random snapshot. It had been inside someone's things, treated like it meant something. I've thought about it every night since. Why would anyone have a picture of me and my mom from that time? Why would they still be there, years after the eviction, acting like they had a right to that space? And more than anything, how did they know I'd come back that day? That part sticks with me." The broom moved. The door locked from the outside. The voice that spoke just once like it didn't need to repeat itself. It wasn't random. It felt planned. A week later, I drove past the site again, just to see. Everything had been leveled. Even the trees were gone, just dirt and gravel where the trailers used to stand. But when I pulled up to the spot where that trailer had been, I saw something propped against a pile of bricks. It was the same broom, standing perfectly upright. I didn't get out of the car, I just sat there, watching it sway slightly in the wind, like someone had just let go of it. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. I was working for the state at the time, based out of a small town near the border of New Mexico. My caseload wasn't light, and most days blurred into the next. Home visits, court reports, the usual mess. The orphanage had been shut down for nearly a decade, but its name still came up once in a while in old files or whispered complaints that never made it past the intake desk. Kids from there were either scattered into foster care or just gone. The place was finally scheduled to be torn down that month, and for some reason, the department asked me to do one last check, maybe to clear their conscience. There was no official directive, just a quiet suggestion from my supervisor. It might be good to walk the property. I didn't ask questions. The building stood alone at the edge of a dried-up field, the chain-link fence barely hanging on in some places. I remember the air being thick with that particular smell old buildings carry. Mold, dust, and something harder to name, like soaked-in memories. It wasn't a huge structure. 2 stories tall, red brick, long-forgotten signage still bolted above the main entrance. The front doors were already cracked open when I got there. No signs of forced entry, but definitely not locked either. I assumed scrappers or bored teenagers had already picked through most of it, and I wasn't expecting to find much. I walked in with my flashlight, notebook, and a bottle of water, planning to be in and out in under an hour. Inside, it was worse than I thought. Furniture was overturned, filing cabinets emptied, graffiti sprayed across every other wall. Some of the rooms still had peeling wallpaper with cartoon animals, rabbits and bears, faded to the point of looking haunted. I checked room after room, mostly storage closets and dorms with bunk beds still bolted to the floors. In what used to be the nurse's station, I found a stack of incident reports shoved inside a drawer. Pages were half shredded and water damaged, but some dates were still legible. What caught my attention wasn't the reports themselves, but a heavy metal cabinet in the corner that looked strangely clean, like someone had wiped the dust off it recently. It was wedged in tight against the wall, but when I leaned into it, the cabinet slid an inch to the left. My heart kicked a little harder. I took a breath and pushed again. Behind it, set into the floor, was a square panel of old wood with a rusted iron ring at the center. A trapdoor, maybe for utilities or old storage. It didn't match the blueprint I'd pulled from the archive earlier that morning. I crouched down, gave the ring a yank, and the panel creaked open. A set of narrow concrete steps descended into darkness. It smelled like earth and metal, and something else I couldn't place. Something stale. I wasn't sure if I should go down, but I'd come this far. So I clicked my flashlight to full beam and started descending, one careful step at a time. The stairs ended in a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The walls were rough cement, and the air was still. Unnaturally still. Every sound I made echoed back, like the tunnel didn't want to keep secrets. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight flicking across old metal pipes and wooden support beams. The floor sloped slightly downward, which made me uneasy. This wasn't just a crawl space or an old root cellar. It had been built with intention. About 20 yards in, the tunnel opened into a small room, no larger than a maintenance closet, and that's when I saw the sleeping bag. It was tucked into the corner neatly, resting on a thin layer of foam. Next to it was a cracked plastic bucket, a few empty water bottles, and a pack of crackers that hadn't expired yet. I stood there staring at it, trying to process whether someone was still using this place or had just left. The dust on the ground had footprints, small ones, and the edges of the foam mat were curled like they'd been used regularly. My instinct screamed that I shouldn't be down there, but I couldn't leave yet. I had to understand what this place was, why it was here, why it wasn't on the original plans. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but there was no signal, and the flashlight app wouldn't open. That's when I noticed my main flashlight dimming. I tapped the side, hoping it was just loose, but the light was definitely fading. The batteries had been full when I checked that morning. I turned to head back the way I came, and just as I passed the tunnel opening, I heard a sharp shuffle of feet behind me. Not a rat, not an echo, actual deliberate footsteps on concrete. My chest tightened. I stood completely still, listening. The air was heavy, like the tunnel itself was holding its breath. I turned around slowly, flashlight raised, but the beam barely reached 5 feet now. The tunnel behind me stretched into darkness, and I couldn't see anything clearly. But the sound came again, softer this time, like someone trying to match my pace, to stay just out of view. I backed up toward the staircase without looking away from the tunnel. I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to hear a voice answer. Something about that silence between each footstep made it worse. Like the person, whoever they were, wasn't in a hurry. They were just waiting for me to panic first. I kept walking backward until I bumped into the bottom step with my heel. I didn't dare turn around. I just climbed one step at a time, flashlight flickering with every movement. Halfway up, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. There was no one there, or at least nothing I could see. But the footsteps had stopped, and somehow that was worse. I pushed the trapdoor open and scrambled into the room, nearly knocking over the cabinet in my rush. I didn't stop to close it. I just ran out of that building like it was on fire. Back in my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a full minute before turning the key. The flashlight was completely dead now. I checked the batteries. Still good. I opened the compartment and looked inside. The metal contacts were corroded, like something had eaten away at them. I'd bought it new 3 weeks earlier. The more I thought about it, the more that room made no sense. Someone had been living down there, recently, quietly, and no one had said a word. I didn't file a full report. I just noted the structural instability and the presence of undocumented sublevels. Nothing more. A week later, I heard that demolition had been delayed. Apparently, someone found blood in the tunnel. No body, no tools, just a dried trail across the cement floor and a pile of shredded fabric where the sleeping bag had been. The state sealed the site pending further investigation, but I know for a fact no one followed up. I asked around quietly. Everyone acted like they'd never heard of the place. It was as if the building had just been a bureaucratic inconvenience, not a place where children used to sleep or disappear. I haven't been back. I changed jobs a few months after that and moved 2 counties over. But I still think about that tunnel more often than I'd like to admit. Not because I'm scared of what was down there. It's the opposite. I'm scared of how normal it looked, how carefully it was hidden, like it wasn't meant to be found, but wasn't meant to be forgotten either.